October 14th, 2:17 a.m. The emergency alert blinked red across every screen in the executive suite of Omnicorp, but no alarm sounded. That was the first sign of something deeply wrong. The security logs showed unauthorized access, originating from within the company's most secure server cluster, the digital vault holding the voting proxies for the upcoming board election. How could a ghost bypass biometric checks and triple-layered encryption? Within the next 48 hours, the 5 most powerful people at Omnicorp, the foundation of its billion-dollar empire, would be systematically voted out, replaced by names nobody had ever heard of. And the chilling reality was this: they would have voted themselves out. The air conditioning unit in Sublevel 3 had always hummed a low, anxious note, a sound the overnight IT team had long since learned to tune out. But on that Tuesday night, the hum was overlaid with a sharp, rhythmic tapping, too fast for human hands on a standard keyboard. It was the sound of purpose. The individuals seated there hadn't logged in using any recognized credentials. They simply were in the system, navigating the internal network like a native language, tracing pathways that corporate firewalls were designed to defend. Every click echoed not with the satisfying thunk of authorization, but the slick slide of intrusion. The knowledge gap was immediate. Who was inside, and how did they know the master override sequence for the proxy server? This wasn't a brute force attack, it was surgical. It felt like a key turning in a lock that only the CEO and the chairman were supposed to possess. We need to backtrack 3 months. Omnicorp was a behemoth in logistics and data management, a company built on the gospel of absolute control. The board of directors, a collection of industry titans who valued tradition over innovation, were preparing for their annual shareholder meeting. 2 seats were up for grabs, and the internal battle for control was already simmering. One seat was held by Alistair Vance, the chairman, a man whose handshake felt like a contract, and the other by Eleanor Hayes, the chief compliance officer, known for her unwavering adherence to outdated protocols. The challenge wasn't the shareholders themselves, it was the mechanics of the vote. Omnicorp used a proprietary digital voting platform, developed in-house 20 years prior, lauded for its security, but never truly audited by external experts. It was a black box of trust. And trust, as we would soon learn, was the single most exploitable vulnerability. The architect of the system, a brilliant forgotten programmer named Marcus Thorne, had left the company a decade ago after a bitter dispute over intellectual property. He vanished from the industry, leaving behind only whispers about the backdoors he'd intentionally embedded in the code. Digital tripwires he claimed were safeguards against the very corporate greed he fled. No one ever took him seriously. They just patched the surface and moved on, back to the night of the breach. The intruder was not Marcus Thorne, not physically anyway. They were working from a secure location hundreds of miles away, moving data packets across encrypted tunnels that shifted address every 90 seconds. The tapping sound continued, relentless. The intruder wasn't interested in stealing trade secrets, they were interested in ownership. The first target was the executive email archive. Not to read the sensitive emails, but to harvest the precise language patterns used in past shareholder communications. Every formal declaration, every internal memo regarding voting procedures, the attacker was building a linguistic fingerprint. This was the digital equivalent of casing the joint by listening to the specific rhythm of the guard's footsteps. The escalation was subtle. A single benign-looking firmware update pushed to the internal network switches, an update that wasn't sourced from the official vendor. This tiny packet of code was the worm, the silent worm that didn't corrupt data, but instead mapped the precise location of the digital proxy ledger. It found it nestled deep within the legacy partition, exactly where Thorne had hidden it. The next morning, the chairman, Alistair Vance, arrived at his office, impeccably dressed, ready to finalize his re-election campaign. He logged into his system. Everything seemed normal. He pulled up the voting dashboard, a visual representation of shareholder commitments. He frowned. A tiny deviation. 3,000 shares previously committed to him had flipped their allegiance to an unknown entity listed only as the fiduciary trust. Vance assumed it was an administrative error, perhaps a clerical slip-up during the early bird voting phase. He initiated a manual override request to correct the tally. The system responded instantly. Manual override requires dual authentication from Compliance Officer Hayes. That was the trap sprung. Vance called Eleanor Hayes. Her line went straight to voicemail. He tried again. a spike of irritation entering his voice. Silence. The knowledge gap widened. Why was compliance offline? Eleanor Hayes was not on vacation. She was currently locked in her penthouse apartment, unaware that her digital identity was being weaponized against her. The intruder had already cloned her access tokens hours before. They didn't need to break into her physical space, they just needed her digital ghost. The attack sequence accelerated. The attacker used Vance's locked credentials, obtained via a sophisticated phishing attack, disguised as a board mandate review 2 weeks prior, to initiate the transfer of voting authority from Vance's account to the fiduciary trust. Simultaneously, they used Hayes's cloned token to authorize the transfer, bypassing the two-person verification because, to the system, both authorized parties were actively confirming the action. The system logs showed two happy confirmations. The reality was one desperate human and one flawless digital puppet master. The rhythmic tapping had stopped. Now there was only the sound of swift automated execution, a machine writing millions of lines of code in seconds, solidifying the vote changes. Chapter break. The resolution of the false tally. It was 11 a.m. when the internal audit team finally flagged the anomaly. Not because the vote count was wrong, but because the source of the voting authority had shifted entirely to the fiduciary trust. The total number of votes hadn't changed, but the control mechanism had been centralized under a single, unregistered entity. The audit team realized the gravity when they tried to lock down the proxy server. Access denied. Every administrative backdoor they tried, including the emergency keys, returned the same sterile response: authorization expired. The central mystery was hardening. Who was the fiduciary trust, and how did they possess the administrative key? The pressure mounted in the boardroom. Vance and the other 3 directors, all facing sudden precipitous drops in their pledged votes, demanded answers. They ordered the CTO, who was sweating visibly, to reverse the actions. The CTO explained, his voice tight. "Sir, the system isn't just changed, it's rewritten. The core security protocols have been updated using the official administrative shell, the shell that validates the entire election. We can't roll back the vote without invalidating the entire meeting, which would invite shareholder lawsuits that would bury us." He was right. The attacker had used the system's own rules to enforce the takeover. The election wasn't manipulated, it was legally executed by the system itself, based on authorized inputs. Then came the final devastating phase. The attacker didn't just submit the votes, they used the administrative access to rewrite the corporate bylaws concerning emergency governance structures, all under the guise of preemptive cybersecurity restructuring. They pushed an amendment that stipulated in the event of catastrophic administrative lockout, a scenario they had just engineered, the board of directors could be immediately dissolved and replaced by a temporary council, whose membership was dictated by the party controlling the majority of validated proxies. Vance, pale and trapped, finally understood. This wasn't corporate espionage, it was a hostile digital annexation. He demanded to know who controlled the fiduciary trust. The CTO, staring blankly at a screen displaying cascading lines of executed code, finally found the one signature that hadn't been scrubbed, a tiny, almost poetic timestamp embedded in the final commit log of the bylaw amendment. It wasn't a modern digital signature. It was an archaic hexadecimal reference to a long-forgotten internal server project from 2012. The project Marcus Thorne had spearheaded, the one they had fired him over. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Marcus Thorne hadn't just embedded tripwires. He had coded a full-spectrum contingency plan, waiting a decade for the right moment, the moment the board was distracted and complacent, to reclaim control through the very system they deemed impenetrable. The next morning, the votes were officially certified. Alistair Vance, Eleanor Hayes, and the 3 other long-standing directors were out. In their place sat 5 individuals listed only by title: Director of Legacy Systems, Overseer of Digital Integrity, Chief Reinvestment Officer. They were unknown entities, proxies for the vengeful ghost in the machine. The takeover was silent, bloodless, and absolute. There were no sirens, no physical confrontation, only the cold, undeniable authority of a successful cyber coup, executed through the mechanism of trust. Omnicorp was no longer run by the titans of industry. It was run by the code they had refused to understand. And somewhere, miles away, The faint, satisfied sound of a keyboard clicking off for the very last time echoed into the void. The ghost had settled back into the wires.